everybody. Today I'm taking a leaf out of the Top Gear playbook. Over the last couple of years, I've had a lot of chances to drive some fantastic Ferraris, and so, for a change, I thought I'd drive a terrible one. What we have here today is the Ferrari Mondial QV, the car regarded by many Ferraristi as the worst they ever made. But does it deserve that reputation? Well, let's find out. The reasons for the Mondial's poor reputation, I think, are fairly simple. First off, it isn't the best looking Ferrari ever made. In fact, I might go so far as to say I don't think it's actually a good looking car, full stop. This of course is subjective, and I know there are plenty out there who would disagree with me, but I just don't think these lines have ever really worked. The Mondial landed in 1980 as the successor to the equally unloved 308 GT4, which actually began life not as a Ferrari but a Dino instead. The change of name, which means global in Italian, was apparently inspired by the fact that at long last this was a car they could sell essentially to anybody, and also at that point Ferrari had been doing rather well in the old Formula 1. In fact, the Mondial name made a sort of subtle reappearance many decades later on the 16M. 16 Mondial, 16 World Championships. Regardless, the formula for both this and its predecessor was the same. It's a 2+2-seater car with a mid-engined V8, one of very few ever produced. It's a rather unusual layout, and to add to the weirdness, not only did they sell it as a coupe, you could even get it as a convertible. However, in spite of its oddness, it was something of a success for the company, with Ferrari selling over 6,000 of them from its introduction in 1990 until its discontinuation in 1993. And at that point, the model lineup was ended, with it having no direct successor. But perhaps the most curious thing of all about the Mondial is if you do speak to people in the know, they will say that for these early cars and its predecessor, the 308, though underneath they are very close to the two-seater 308, the GTB and the GTS, the people that have driven them both tend to say it's actually these that are better. Alright, 3-point turn hill start torture test. This couldn't go badly at all, could it? Oh, the turning circle is tragic. The steering is manual. Visibility is excellent because it's an old car, but oh, this is not going to go well at all, is it? Am I going to scrape? No. Am I going to drive into the side? No, just about got away with it. Oh, yeah, that wasn't fun. I'm going to avoid that. Making things, I think, even more confusing for modern-day buyers is the fact that in its 14 years, the Mondial existed in no fewer than 4 distinct generations, each mirroring, effectively, the two-seater of the time. So when the car launched, it was dubbed the Mondial 8 and was effectively the same as the 308 GTBi, the fuel-injected variant of the car, which made some 215 horsepower. In 1982, this then landed the QV for 4-valve. The engine was actually already a double overhead cam design, but with only 2 valves per cylinder, and that changed for this. Power then rose back to the 240 that the old 308 had made when it had carbs, but these never did, and torque was 190 pounds-feet. Yeah, 260 newton meters. So not a lot. All of which, though, is sent to the rear wheels exclusively through the classic Ferrari gated shifter. Here, a 5-speed with a dogleg first. In terms of the coupes, the QV is the most numerous of all Mondials, with just over 1,100 having been made. Then, in 1985, the car morphed into the Mondial 3.2, with both the engine and the styling adopting the template set by the then new Ferrari 328. As the name would imply, the engine grew from not actually 3 litres, instead closer to 2.9 up to 3.2, and power rose to 270 horses. Then finally, in 1988, the car saw its biggest transformation of all, becoming the Mondial T, which adopted much of the running gear of the then current Ferrari 348. The reason it's called the T is not because it is turbocharged. In fact, it is designed to replicate the way that the rear was then laid out. Because in the first 3 generations of car, the engine is mounted transversely, so side to side. However, for the T, they then turned it 90 degrees, so it went front to back, north-south in some people's parlance, or longitudinal if you prefer. This is where Lamborghini get the LP designation for some of their cars from. The gearbox itself was then mounted transversely, and this forms the T where the car gets its name. And for those last of line cars, they had the same power as in the 348, so a nice round 300 horses. Most weirdly, and I don't really know why this was the case, but with the Mondial T, the convertibles actually outsold the coupes quite dramatically, with over 1,100 being made, by far the most of any generation of the Mondial. I think Chris Harris has a Mondial convertible. Can't remember if it's a T or what, but I'm sure he does have one. Odd cars. And to be perfectly honest, I don't think I'd really like to place a bet on whether it's that or his V10 M5 that's ultimately going to cost more to put right. And on the face of it, there is actually quite a bit to like about the Mondial. Though it isn't the prettiest car, I do think it is prettier than its predecessor, which was styled by Bertone. This one instead was pinned by Ferrari favourite Pininfarina. It was never going to be a looker on account of the packaging, but inside, though you don't really have 4 proper seats, you could say you've got either 3 sort of useful seats, 4 if you all happen to be Italian jockeys, or for most, room for 2 and a ludicrous amount of luggage. So first off, you've got access to the back seats, then behind the engine you also have a generously sized boot, and if you are really desperate, there is also a storage area up the front, though it's currently mostly full of spare wheel. And incidentally, the wheels on this car are not 13s, 14s or even 15s. They're 390s, because this wears the Michelin metric system of the day, the TRX, which back in the 80s seemed like a really cool and space-age thing and a very good idea that latterly has turned out not to be so great, because getting tyres for certain cars that wore TRXs is problematic. Happily, not for these. The interior then is a lovely and classic 1980s Ferrari blend of cool, old-school Veglia dials with a nice quartet of them over to the left. The clock does look very much of its age though, and the 6 circular buttons over to the right here is something I don't think I've seen in any other Ferrari, but they do work, and they activate things like the bonnet release for the back and various other things. They're kind of handy, I guess. The materials in here are lovely too, a mixture of leathers, carpets and various different things, and all the switchgear feels far closer to 328 than it does 308. It's a very in-betweeny thing, as the 2+2 models often are. I love the, I believe, original and correct radio cassette down here, which now has a little Bluetooth adapter in it, and the also seriously retro sort of fault-finding screen down here. This car has been brought to me by its lovely owner, Adrian, who I think you'll agree doesn't look like your average Ferrari owner. And he bought it a couple of years ago because he found himself in a situation where he'd come into a little bit of money and wanted to buy something interesting. He first set out looking for an air-cooled 911, but quickly discovered that prices for those had gone through the roof, and any he could afford wouldn't be one that he wanted to buy. A DeLorean was something else he considered, but again, getting one is difficult and getting a good one really difficult, so he started looking at Mondials. And this cropped up, a one previous owner car, which had been off the road for quite some time. It had been well used. The odometer currently sits on just shy of 49,000 miles, and you can tell that it has definitely been a few places. Under Adrian's ownership, it has been as far south as Italy, where he took it to the Grand Prix, and I must admit, I'm very, very jealous of that. It's also been to places like Bicester, and in the first year, the water pump seized, but barring that, it's actually been pretty good to him. Sat here as I am now, it's comfortable. The seats are a little narrow, but they're perfectly all right. You could do a good long journey. The exhaust is making quite the racket, but it's not standard. By default, they are far, far too quiet. Now I think it might be far too loud, but you know what? That's not the car's fault. once you have even a couple of mile an hour behind you, the steering isn't really actually all that difficult at all. Even around a car park, it's not actually horrendous. The gearbox is very typical Ferrari, so on occasion you have to be gentle with it, and on other occasions you have to manhandle the thing. The pedals are all fairly close together, but actually quite light, and then when you find yourself on a nice open bit of road, you can drop a couple of gears and do this. And I have to say, from where I'm sat right now, this feels pure old school Ferrari. Sure, somebody in a modern day Mercedes C200 diesel would be pulling away from you there, but it doesn't matter because it feels special, it looks different, it sounds great, and if you've signed up for a car like this, you already knew the performance wasn't ever going to be stellar, and I would say for most people, from here, it'd tick the boxes. So why is it a car that for so long has been so unloved? You can't ignore the looks, you really can't. It is a Ferrari, it's got to be pretty, and I just don't think this is. But we've already mentioned that, and I don't think that alone is responsible for this car's reputation. It is also a Ferrari four-seater, and historically speaking, those were the quickest depreciating cars on planet Earth. Look at what in some ways was this car's eventual successor, the 456, a front-engined V12 Ferrari that by all accounts is a brilliant car. Those at one point in time you could pick up for, well, buttons. Oh, and just in case you think you recognise that Ferrari, you do. Adrian's had a few different jobs over the years. Recently, he was a car designer, and then, post-COVID, he decided to go into automotive journalism. He has written for Haggerty, and today he's out in the 550 writing a piece for a publication called the Autopian. I'll put a link to it in the description down below if it's released by the time this goes out. Even the ride quality in this thing's actually really, really good. There's plenty of tyre, which helps. The suspension is also very well set up for road use. You've got wishbones on all four corners, disc brakes, of course, too. And it just, well, it does the business. It feels like a very, very competent road car. Steering feel is lovely, as you would hope from an unassisted rack, but it's never guaranteed. Feel from the brakes, which are assisted, is absolutely delightful. The weighting of the steering is fantastic, the turn-in, nice and keen. The body control isn't the tightest it could possibly be, but it's kind of in keeping with the rest of the car, really. You can bimble along in this car at sort of 6 or 7 tenths, a very, very happy person indeed. I should give some special mention to my friend Jack over at number 27, because apparently the exhaust here was done by the same people over at Vista that did his, and his car was the inspiration for Adrian doing that to this. And I would say that compared to the 328 that I drove recently, which in fairness was a convertible and therefore compromised, this is at least as good, if not maybe a little bit better. And yet still, people didn't want to buy them. Now, no Ferrari is cheap to run, but the fact is that compared to, say, stuff like the 456, this was always going to be quite a bit cheaper. The mechanical elements of it are reasonably simple, and yes, today getting parts on occasion can be a pain, but the fact is that for regular routine maintenance and servicing, they're not that complicated to work on. You can get to just about everything you need in the engine, and even a cam belt service is something like £700. Perhaps crucially though, I've just driven past a small boy who looked at it and went, and really, what more validation could any car possibly need? Definitely got more bark than bite this, but doesn't bother me. More crackles and pops than Kellogg's as well, this thing. The first thing that actually strikes you when you get in this is just how low down you sit. I got out of the 550, which is already not a particularly tall car, but when you're in this and you're sat next to that, you go, oh crikey. Even in later cars like the 360, the 430, you just don't feel as low slung as you do in this. The dash also being where it is, sort of down here, gives you that great view of the road, and it's a fabulous thing. It really, really is. Though you can't really see much of the bonnet, which is a shame, you can still place the car fairly easily. It's not really that big. I'm having a great time in this. I really, really am. I think, though, the truth is, the Mondial's biggest problem was effectively its own reputation as being the cheapest of Ferraris, because all older cars, especially hand-built Italian ones, well, you can't leave them alone for a long time, and you certainly can't try and run them on a budget. That is a very, very effective way to turn what is a decent and usable car into a heck of a project. You could have bought one of these for a long time for less than the price of a new Fiesta ST. And that was always a very tempting thing, and there was a sort of running joke that the only reason anybody would buy a Mondial is because it was the cheapest Ferrari you could get your hands on, and therefore the implication was it was owned exclusively by people that couldn't afford to run it. This, I think, is unfair, and though I'm sure true for a few people, not all. The issue is that in the last sort of decade or so, like many other Ferraris, the prices have begun to rise. And now the market is in a tricky situation where you can no longer pick one of these up for like 12 grand. It's just not going to happen. And today, looking at Car and Classic, prices are, well, they're all over the place, and they make little to no sense, with QVs being priced higher than Ts, and cars with high mileage asking more than those with low mileage, and projects asking strong money, but apparently running working cars not being that pricey. It's all very odd. And I think the simple fact is, if you do want a Ferrari, you want a classic Ferrari, and maybe you need those back seats, you don't fancy spending the 70 plus £1,000 that it'd take to get into a 308 or a 328, one of these is definitely a good option. It's not going to be any cheaper to run than one of those, and you definitely want to do your homework. Not just your CarVertical check, but also get a proper inspection done, because one of these that's a project, if you haven't dealt with this sort of thing before, it could be a much bigger project than you may first realise. Sometimes I've heard more than one story where someone's bought one of these cars, oh, it just needs this and this, and you're done. And there's a reason this and this hasn't been done, because that's the unobtainium bit of the car. And what were those prices? Well, they seem to start at about £25,000 to £30,000, with £30,000 apparently getting you a car you can actually get in and drive. They then went up to sort of £50,000, but a lot of these were sort of POA, which is a bit odd, because I don't think it was POA because they're expensive. I think it's POA because, well, they just don't know how to price the thing. Although, in spite of this, the meteoric rise in price of the old air-cooled 911s, I think, has served to make this, comparatively, once again good value. After all, it's a Ferrari. It's always going to be a special thing. I love the 911s. I think they're great cars, but you cannot argue they are far more numerous. You see a 911, that's a Tuesday, or in London, simply a day that ends with a Y. You see a Ferrari, though, that's a great day. Now I've driven this, I really do have to try and find somebody, and if this is a description that fits you, please email in, that has one of the Lamborghini equivalents of the day, of the very late 70s and the 1980s, the Yalpa, the Urraco, maybe even the Silhouette. They're very cool and weird cars in their own way, and I kind of love weird and wonderful. And look, for someone like myself, I just don't like the looks of the Mondial, and therefore I was never going to buy one. But now, having driven it, I've got to say, if you're not put off by those, but for whatever reason you haven't bought one, you really should reconsider it. It's a proper Ferrari. I like it. So, that I think is all for today. A short video, but, well, a very successful one from my perspective. I want to say a big thank you to Adrian for bringing this out, and as ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.